welcome to the Brain Fix podcast, discussing all things brain. I'm Dr. Nina Milosavljevic, lecturer in neuroscience at the University of Manchester, and our guest on the podcast today is Professor of Neuroscience, Rob Lucas, who is also the director of Center for Biological Timing in Manchester. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
We had a pleasure to have an episode with you earlier, and today we're going to again talk about your research interests that are related to how animals respond to light and what are the mechanisms for light detection. But we're going to talk more about kind of application in the real life. So why is it important to think about our light environment? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I can. So I think the first thing to say on that is that throughout almost all of human evolutionary history, we didn't have to think about our light environment, right? Because there's nothing we could do about it. The sun comes up in the morning and it goes out down in the evening. It's light during the day and it's more or less dark at night. And so it's really only the last couple of 100 years where we've had the technology to generate significant amounts of light for ourselves. And that's an incredible freedom, right? Because it means that you can decide, well, for example, in the evening that I'd like to read a book. So I'll turn the light on to read a book or whatever it might be. And similarly, during the day, well, I'd like to work indoors because today the weather's bloody horrible. And therefore I can light an indoor environment so that I can be productive and comfortable during the day. So it's an incredible freedom and a great advance in that, at least to me, in the sum of human happiness to be able to generate our own light. But of course, if you have that kind of agency, if you now are able to decide what light to produce, it then falls on you to think about the decision points about how bright that light needs to be, when you should be exposed to light and when you should experience darkness, and what wavelengths of light are most important. And so that's really why we need to start thinking about light. Because we have that freedom, we need to think about how we're going to use that freedom. And it's been because that the use of light has really evolved for people's convenience, the primary driver for those decisions has been the type of light we need in order to see, right? Because that's what we use light for primarily. So in terms of decision points about lighting, there've been a lot about what we need in order to be able to see effectively, and secondarily just what people find pleasant, what is appealing to them. And increasingly now there's an additional driver, which is energy efficiency, of course. So that's really important to think about how you can generate light in an efficient way and light our environments without minimizing the impact on, bills, but also on the planet. So if you think about it, those are the two kind of drivers at the moment that are primarily determining the light that you experience, definitely in public buildings, but also in your world at home. So what those of us in the biological timing community and those of us who are interested in how light regulates physiology more general would argue is that there really should be a third determinant that we need to start thinking more about, which has been neglected because the types of light effects that we're interested in are largely subconscious. So, for example, we know very well that humans, like almost all life on Earth, has a biological clock, a 24-hour biological clock or circadian clock. And it's that circadian clock which sets up 24-hour rhythms in our physiology and behavior, determines when we feel sleepy, when we want to go to bed, when we feel hungry, all of those sorts of things. And that biological clock is set every day by our light exposure. So if you have lots of light exposure in the evening, for example, that will set the phase of your biological clock later, which means that you're less likely you'll stay up later, go to bed later. In the morning, the alarm clock wakes you up. It means you've had less sleep than you should do. And there's lots of evidence now that this kind of pattern of behavior can be a consequence of of ill health and poor productivity and things like that. So that's an example of a way in which we're currently not thinking as much as we should do about the light that we're exposed to, because it's less evident than the choices we might make about how it appears to us through our conscious visual system, and also the drivers for energy efficiency.
Right, I see. So it's obviously great, as you said, that we have this freedom to decide how our light environment is going to look like. But how we're going to make these decisions? So what is healthy lighting?
Yeah, so at least in terms of qualitative description, I think it's relatively straightforward, right? That what you want is a bright daytime, which approaches more like, daytime light, and as little light during the evening and through the night as possible. Well, definitely on the run up to sleep. If you're preparing to sleep, then we need to reduce our light. So it's so sort of obvious that it seems like a truism, right? That, you want to go back to kind of, prehistoric times when our body is designed to have bright light during the day and dim light or darkness through the night. So that's really what we should be trying to achieve. Of course, actually achieving that is tricky. I mean, I don't turn my lights off in the evening. I want to do what I want to do. So really where the interesting questions arise is what does that mean in quantitative terms? What exactly does it mean when I say we want bright light during the day or dim light in the evening and through night?
Right. So but it seems like we kind of know what we need to do. The question is like whether we do it. That's obviously, and I guess it gets very appealing to stay longer in the evening, read something, do something exciting, than just switch off light and go to bed. Yeah. Is there anything else that we can do? Because you mentioned something about brighter days. So is there anything that, like, if we really want to stay up later, is there anything that we can do to compensate for the effects of that?
Sorry, you say you want to stay up later?
Yeah, like have a light in the evening.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Is there anything else that we can do to kind of still do that?
Yeah, sure.
But then be healthy.
Yeah. Yes. So, I think there are immediate answers to that question, and then obviously this is an area what we're currently researching. So maybe I'll talk about the research later on. But what immediately can we do really comes, in a way, it comes to this question of being a little bit more quantitative in how we describe dim light, right? And there's people might be, for example, using screen yellowing apps and things like this. And what those are is a way of trying to reduce the effective light intensity for the photoreceptors that set our clock while still enabling us to see. And that's, again, really an important topic for the lighting industry and consumer electronics industry to keep on top of, right? And it comes to something which sounds esoteric, but actually is really, really important, which is how do we measure light, right? So at the moment, the ways in which light are measured, so people will have heard of units such as lux, for example, or maybe lumens, or color. These are all units which try to predict the human perceptual experience of light, okay? And they don't then necessarily quantify light in a way which predicts how much it's going to shift your clock. And the reason for that is that the photoreceptor that's really responsible for that, which is a photoreceptor called melanopsin, is more sensitive to shorter wavelengths of light than most of our visual system. And that those shorter wavelengths often appear blue, not always. Well, if you just have those wavelengths on their own, they appear blue to us. But there's not a perfect relationship between spectrum and color. But the reason that we use a screen yellowing app, for example, is because we're trying to reduce those short wavelengths of light, and that has the effect of changing the appearance of the light and make it more sort of yellow. But from an engineering perspective, what we need to do is to move towards numbers and sort of say, well, okay, I want to quantify my light just as I might say my light is 500 lux. I need some way of quantifying it in terms of its effect on my biological clock. And that's something that we in Manchester have spent a lot of time working on, is trying to introduce a new series of measures which now will allow the lighting industry in the first instance, and maybe hopefully consumers eventually, to be able to measure their light and say that's its likely effectiveness on my biological clock, and therefore against a standard prediction of what a human should respond to, it's either too bright or too dim. And this has resulted in the acceptance of a new way of measuring light called melanopic EDI, which is an unfortunately complicated word for something which is quite simple, which is that then instead of now, in addition, hopefully your light, you'll be able to look at it not only in terms of its lumens, for example, lumens per watt, how bright it's going to appear, but also in terms of how likely it is to affect your biological clock. And that becomes a tool that designers can use to say, okay, during the daytime, I'd like it to reach this level, and in the evening, we'd like it to fall below this level. Let's engineer around that in such a way that we can, as you say, enable people to go about their evening life as they enjoy it with having a minimal effect or minimizing the effect on their biological clock or biological timing.
Well, that sounds really good. Obviously, promising for us who really want to, live modern life, not go back in the cave time. But you mentioned industry, and are there any kind of problems or issues that the lighting industry might face with this kind of designing this healthy lighting?
Well, so the great thing is that because of the new technologies in lighting over the last 15 years or so, 20 years, particularly solid state lighting like LEDs, the opportunity to generate light with different wavelength composition, different intensity is there's no technological barrier really to producing almost any light that you might want to. So what the barriers really are to do with this idea of balancing the various requirements for lighting. So I mentioned two at the start, which were visual appearance and energy efficiency. And now, if we can start to help people to think about these non-visual effects, these kind of biological timing effects, if you think of light as well, then you can start having three pillars on which you consider lighting design and thinking about the relative importance of each of those drivers. So I think that's probably what we as biologists can do to help the lighting industry to contribute to this. Because in my experience of talking to the lighting industry, they're very interested in exactly this problem, because they want to do the best they can with their lighting products.
Okay, well, that sounds really good, and hopefully we can maybe see new lamps or lighting design soon that's going to compensate and improve our healthy, give us a healthy light environment. But it gets me to the final question, and I really want to hear more about what are you currently working on?
So I think the other thing that maybe we should start thinking more about, really, as a research community, is the importance of daytime light. And that's something that I think in my lab we're really interested in at the moment, because there's been a lot of attention on the problems of light at night and how damaging that can be. And that's been very important realization. On the other hand, there comes to a point where, we can finger wag at one another and say, well, you shouldn't have the light on in the evening. But it's kind of unrealistic. As I say, I don't go to bed at 8 o'clock. People want to have the lifestyle that they want, and for many good reasons. Whereas the other element of having access to light, which maybe we don't think enough about, is how being indoors during the day, and for particularly maybe for people who don't have as much choice about their light environment and are stuck indoors, so maybe people in nursing homes or, for example, prisons, that kind of environment, hospitals, the light they have during the day is too dim. It's much, much dimmer than natural daylight, certainly, for almost all circumstances. And we're trying to understand whether boosting that daytime light can itself have a benefit for your biological timing processes. So we're doing work looking at the relationship between light exposure and sleepiness and patterns of sleep in healthy humans. And as well as that, we're working in the lab to understand how experimental manipulations to the light environment can change the amplitude of your circadian clock and, for example, alter its photosensitivity. And yeah, we're very excited about the possibility that by changing your daytime light exposure, this could be a much more amenable manipulation for most people than looking at their evening light exposure, and could have, help people to have healthy sleep-wake cycles, for example, with all the knock-on benefits for productivity and general health.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. So just a final question. So is there anything you can advise us what we can do to kind of improve, as we said, like our circadian clock processes and all that? Is there anything, what kind of light? Should we go outside more in the day, or what should we do?
Yeah, well, that's the simple answer, right? And yeah, it's definitely going out during the day if possible. And just to realize that even here we are, it's not always sunny in Manchester. And particularly at this time of year, the sun is very low and it looks like it's very dim outside. It's invariably much brighter outside than it is indoors, right? So if you're able to go outside and experience outdoor light, then I think that's generally a good thing to do. And similarly, although I've talked about these processes being subconscious, which they are, still we can see if, for example, we're having difficulty sleeping, then maybe experiment with changing your light exposure as one of the things that you could do just to see if that works, right? Because it's not going to work for everybody, but for some people that might be an issue. And to realize, maybe particularly for, I've got teenage children, and one of the things that we all as teenagers do is tend to stay up later. And realizing that there's this positive feedback between the light that you expose yourself through the evening, which, first of all, the light tends to make people less sleepy. So you're exposing yourself to that light. It makes you less sleepy, which means you expose yourself to more light, which changes the phase of your circadian clock, which means you're likely to want to stay up later and later and later. And you can end up in situations where you have people going to bed very late at night and having difficulty waking up in the morning. Maybe think about your light exposure both during the day and in the evening to see if you can try and change that.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob, for being our guest today and for sharing all your insights. This has been the Brain Fix podcast. Any feedback on this or future content or sponsorship inquiries, please send to the DNS inbox, dns@manchester.ac.uk with podcast in the subject line. Tune in next time for more neuroscience.